On today's Locked On Jayhawks, we dive into why it hasn't totally worked with the transfer portal this year for Bill Self, and specifically with AJ Storr and Ryland Griffen maybe not living up to expectations.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening? Derek Johnson here. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for making it your first listen every day. Thank you to the everydayers catching each and every episode. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find us on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. On today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we're going a little bit over what has gone wrong? Why is it that these transfers are not working with Bill Self? What lessons can we learn from, I guess, what you've gotten from AJ Storr, and to a lesser extent, Ryland Griffen, who still has been contributing, starting, and doing some things, but maybe not to the level that you might have been hoping for, and clearly that's not happening with AJ Storr. So we're getting into what's going on there, what it can teach us kind of moving forward for Bill Self and the transfer portal. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Do that at FanDuel. All right, so let's start right here. I think when you look at the transfer portal class that KU brought in, this pretty much applies to two guys. Now, I guess you could throw Shaq Moore into this bucket as well, of guys that maybe haven't lived up to the expectations. But with Shaq Moore, I think it's more injury-related than anything. When he was playing healthy, he was having a solid impact on the team when he entered the starting lineup at the beginning of January, and then he started playing through the injury. He wasn't the same, and now he's just kind of hurt. He was hurt at the beginning of the year. So that one's a little bit of a different bucket that you would put that into. And I know like Zeke Mayo has struggled on the road, didn't have a great game against Colorado, but like overall, if you would have said before the season you were going to get 14.3 points per game, 5 rebounds, 3 assists per game on 40% from three from Zeke Mayo right now, you would have gladly taken that. And then with Diggy Coit, he's shooting 39% from three. He has a very specific role off the bench that he seems content doing. So with those ones, I don't think you can have it as much. When you look at the I don't know, the hype of the transfer class that you brought in, and maybe not living up to the hope that you wanted to, that would have made this team the best team in the country, or was the thought of many why on paper they had this as the number one preseason team. You look to the wing position, and those two guys with Ryland Griffen and AJ Storr, I mean, maybe even before the season started, there were moments where I certainly thought so at different points that the starting lineup would end up being DeJuan Harris, Ryland Griffen, AJ Storr, KJ Adams, and Hunter Dickinson, right? And that stuff obviously hasn't happened. And when you look at it, it's something where I think with Ryland Griffen, like I said, he still has contributed. And I think Ryland Griffen has, for me, more hope that he's going to go on a hot streak to finish off here. With AJ Storr, it's just kind of getting to a point where it's a little bit more unplayable. So what exactly has gone wrong? Is this on Bill Self? Is this on the player? Is this on situation? Is it on? I want to get into that, and let's dive into AJ Storr first. So when you look at this, the stats are obviously down for AJ Storr. He went from averaging 16.8 points per game on a Wisconsin team that got a 5 seed in the NCAA tournament to now what a Kansas team is actually projected to be like a 6 seed right now, and he's averaging 6 points per game. So it's technically you win to a worse team if you're just looking by that one very basic way of looking at things, and you're averaging less than half the amount of points per game. And it's not just the points per game is down because the roll is down and the minutes are down. The efficiency is down big time too. Storr's field goal percentage was 43% at Wisconsin. It's 37 this year at Kansas. 3-point percentage was 32. It's 26.5. This is the weird one. The free throw percentage is down from 81% at Wisconsin to 65% at Kansas. That tells me there's some mental aspect to it, right? His effective field goal percentage down from 48% to 44% at Kansas. His true shooting percentage down from 53% to 45% at Kansas. That's a sizable jump. His offensive rebound rate and his defensive rebound rate have both dropped from last year at Wisconsin, and he wasn't really known for being a very good rebounder at Wisconsin, and that's dropped. He has a higher turnover rate this year than last year. His O rating went from 109 at Wisconsin to a 91, basically points per 100 possessions when he is on the floor. That's a huge differential. His box score plus minus is a plus 4.9. That's basically your average plus minus per game. He's a negative 1.3 this year for Kansas. So he has been a net negative for KU on the court after being a net basically +5 every game for Wisconsin last season. And then you look at it against KenPom top 50 opponents, he had a 52.6 true shooting percentage. This season against KenPom top 50 opponents, 38.6 true shooting percentage. True shooting percentage, basically, you get extra points for threes and free throws and stuff like that. And basically is a way of saying, oh, this center's shooting 60% but hasn't shot a three. And this guy is only shooting 40% from the floor, but he's shooting 40% in three. And so those are equal the same amount, per shot in theory at that percentage. So that's been a number that's dropped almost 15%. And then you look at it too. Storr averaged more points per game last season at Wisconsin than his season high is this year at Kansas. Season high this year is 16. His season average at Wisconsin was 16.8. And after having only 2 games where he had single-digit scoring games as a sophomore at Wisconsin, only 2 games of single-digit scoring, he now has just 6 games at Kansas in double-digit scoring as a junior. It has been completely turned on its head night and day. And what's interesting here is there are certain things that, he did well that just haven't translated. And this is the part where it's like, you can't blame, Bill Self isn't doing well, acclimating the transfer here. When you bring somebody on who is good at something and then they become not good at that thing anymore, it's not just about, fit or how you're bringing the player along, stuff like that. Like at some point, there is a certain notion of it on the player. And so when you're looking at certain things, AJ Storr went from ranking in the 60th percentile in free throw attempt rate to now just in the 25th percentile. So he's not getting to the free throw line anymore. He's not maybe driving as hard or as well as he was at Wisconsin. Part of that could be, the spacing, maybe a little bit, but still. Would you believe me if I told you that AJ Storr last season, for his position, ranked in the 89th percentile for his turnover rate? Would you believe me with what you have gotten to see this year from him? That was the case last year. Haven't seen it this year. At the rim last season, he shot 64% at the rim. That was 74th percentile for his position. This year, he's at 57%. That's below average nationally. In the paint, but not at the rim, he's down from 34.5% to 26%. Mid-range, he's gone from being a pretty good mid-range shooter, 38%, to this year being just 33% from the mid-range. Above the break threes, down from almost 31% to 27%. Corner threes, he's down from 43% on corner threes at Wisconsin to 25% on corner threes at Kansas. But what I find interesting is the volume has gone up on corner threes for him. But basically everything is just worse. So, this isn't a situation, it's almost like you say, hey, we brought this transfer in because we think he's going to, obviously this doesn't apply as much for Storr, but we brought this transfer in because we think that he's going to be, or he's shown the ability to be this knockdown corner 3-point shooter at high volume. And then he comes to Kansas and he can't hit a corner 3 to save his life. That was almost like the Nick Timberlake situation too. But that one makes a little bit more sense because you had the adjustment to competition. This one makes even less sense because all those things have just gotten worse, but he still was at a power level last season. If we're looking for kind of a verdict here, I do want to touch back on that corner 3 thing with AJ Storr. So again, 43% on corner threes at Wisconsin, 25% on corner threes so far this season. But he's taken 24 corner threes so far this season. Last season, all of last season, right? Because the season's done. Season's still going this year for Kansas. All of last season, he only had 21 attempted corner threes. So he's taken more corner threes this season than he took last season, all of last season. And that's even when last season he was playing double the amount of minutes that he's playing this season. So I do wonder how much of that, that's something you could point back to and be like, yeah, if your whole goal here was to have this guy who would be a corner 3-point shooter from the wing, this was a bad fit from the start to kind of have. And I don't think Bill Self has trust in AJ Storr, but at the same point in time, and yeah, sure, you could make the argument of, give these players a longer leash. I don't think AJ Storr's done anything to earn a longer leash. In fact, I kind of think if this was not NIL tied down, AJ Storr would typically have been cut from the rotation by now. I think he'd be getting some DNPs, but because you have the NIL stuff come into play where guys are promised things, and yes, you could say, okay, well, If you think he's going to transfer at the end of the year, what do you care about promising him? Well, that stuff gets around the portal. That stuff gets out to other players. I don't know what agent AJ Storr has, but that agent probably has other prospects that are going to be entering the portal this season, and you don't want to spurn that relationship. So it is a difficult thing that you have to kind of tightrope walk if you are Bill Self. Now, could it just be going back to the NIL thing? Like maybe it's just as simple as like AJ Storr feels too much pressure and he hasn't been able to handle it? Or is it just that he's content cashing a paycheck and he's just like, whatever happens, we'll roll the ball out here, right? I don't know. Could be either of those things, could be none of those things. But I think some of those things that we just touched on are true. And I also combine those with the fact that, I don't think this ever was a great fit, right? AJ Storr ranked in the 99th percentile in usage rate when he was at Wisconsin. That was never going to be the thing now that he's at Kansas. And yes, you could also say that, he's kind of more of a straight line drive, power wing who likes to get downhill, and the spacing was never going to be there for Kansas too. That might be a fair comment to make about the fit, but also looking back at the Wisconsin team last year that he was on, you realize they started a power forward in Tyler Wall, who was 3 for 16 from 3 last season, next to a 7-footer. So like they were playing two bigs. And yes, their 7-footer, Steven Crowell, was a good 3-point shooter, 45% from 3 on limited volume. But if you add up Tyler Wall and Steven Crowell, their two starting big men, if you add up their total 3-point attempts, you get 74 3-point attempts, which basically means that they were taking like a little over 2 3-pointers per game from the big man position. So like, was it really creating that much more spacing for AJ Storr than he has now, even though you're playing KJ next to Hunter, right? Like, I don't know that that's the case. So I don't even know if you could point to that as the fit thing. I think it's more of the corner thing. Like you brought him in and essentially turned him into a corner 3-point shooter, and that's not really his game, and was kind of a waste there. And then there's some stuff that he's at fault and some stuff that you're at fault. I think this is just one of those where it's just you kind of point fingers all the way around. All right, what about Ryland Griffen? Is there hope for a big run in March here? This episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That is FanDuel.com. You can get Kansas against Texas Tech on Saturday. You can get KU football plus 800 to win the Big 12. Your shot at $150 in bonus bets with FanDuel. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA and the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you to Everydayers catching all of our episodes. Make Locked On College Basketball your second listen every day. Okay, what about Ryland Griffen? Because that was going to AJ Storr, and you see some of the things there that it just doesn't seem like that's ever going to be recovered. I still do have hope that Ryland Griffen can find his stride at Kansas, and the hope would be that he can come back for another season and really find his stride next season working around Darren Peterson. But the stats are also down here for Griffen, not quite as down as they are for AJ Storr. Griffen, same situation, though. He played on a 4-seed Alabama team, obviously made the Final Four, and now you're projected to be a worse seed at Kansas, and yet you go down from 26 minutes per game to 20 minutes per game, right? Points per game dropped from 11.2 to 6.9. Now, again, the minutes are different, so if you use per 40 to just compare it, it'd be about a 3-point difference per game in what he's getting here. But the efficiency is the notable thing that's down. And again, it's not down to the point of where AJ Storr's is, but it's like it's a rung down basically, right? His field goal percentage 45 last year at Alabama, it's 41 this year at Kansas. His 3-point percentage still good at 36% for Kansas, but it was 39% at Alabama on even higher volume. Free throw percentage. This is another one where, going back to the Storr one, this one feels like a confidence thing to me again. 81% at Alabama, 69% at Kansas. His effective field goal percentage down from 58 to 53%. His O rating went from 123 at Alabama to now 109 at Kansas. His offensive and defensive rebound rates are down as well. His box score plus minus still solid at a plus 4.3 for Kansas, but it is lower than it was last season in Alabama when he was a plus 5.4. And he has this year 3 games where he has made 3 or more 3-pointers, including that game against Houston. Last season in Alabama, he had 10 such games. So you see the ability to go off was a little bit more often there at Alabama. And I think these are really two different case studies with Griffin compared to, AJ Storr, because Griffin still is starting. He's still playing in general. Storr has just been kind of straight up bad and might just be getting minutes because of the NIL stuff. Like, I think Griffin, you hope, has another year of future with Kansas, and on top of it has a big March upcoming here. And the things that haven't translated, it is low volume for both, but the rim field goal percentage, he was 75% at the rim at Alabama, 94th percentile for his position. He's only 60% at the rim this year at Kansas, which is still above average nationally, 56th percentile. But I find that very interesting. We'll circle back to that in a second. His above the break threes, it's about 2% lower. His corner threes go down from 44% in Alabama to 37% at Kansas on actually more attempts per game. So again, Kansas sticking somebody into the just be a corner 3-point shooter mold, which does make sense actually for Ryland Griffen, but nonetheless, the mid-range shooting is actually better this year for Ryland Griffen, so that one is better. The deep shooting, so shout out to Kyle Martin on this one, who reached out to me and pointed this out to me. So I started looking at the numbers, and I find this very interesting. So at Alabama, Ryland Griffen shot 44 three balls of 25 or more feet, according to CBB Analytics. He shot them at a 31.8% clip, which is like slightly above average nationally when you're shooting threes from that deep, right? At Kansas, he's only attempted 15, so about a third of those 25 or more foot threes, and he's only made 2. That's good for 13%. 13%, 31.8%, right? Doesn't take a mathematician to know that's a very big difference there. How about NBA range? Because there are certain threes that you can take that aren't 25 plus feet, right? They can be 24 feet that are still NBA range, so are still deeper threes than the college game, but they're not like super deep like the 25 plus. And last season in Alabama, Ryland Griffen took 161 three-point attempts from NBA range. He hit them at 38.5%. So he was knocking down NBA range threes, which is going to only open up your spacing and gravity even more. At Kansas, he's launched 89 of them. So, those numbers are clearly lower, but still more seasoned for KU. But here's the big difference. From NBA range, instead of shooting 38.5% at Alabama, he's only shooting 32.6% from NBA range here at Kansas. So, just not finding a way to go in. So I think when you're looking at the verdict for this one, I think the lower field goal percentage to me, like when I'm looking at, I don't know, maybe the corner threes not being quite as open. When I look at the at the rim percentage, right? Like that was a big one to look at there. The at the rim percentage was way better when he was at Alabama. That just comes down to me the less spaced floor with a much worse offense around him. Like think back to that Alabama offense last year. It was one of the best offenses in the country, and that's what Nate Oates does. He paces, he spaces, he shoots a lot of threes, right? He pressures the rim. And so I do think that that's almost the tax that you put on a shooter to come into Kansas. That like he's going to get guarded a little bit more at Kansas because he is like the go-to threat on the outside from shooting threes, him and Zeke Mayo, right? And then the driving lanes aren't going to be there as often, right? Because the thing in Alabama, when he was at Alabama last year, is sometimes teams would overemphasize guarding the three, and then all of a sudden Ryland Griffen's wide open at the rim on a cut or driving that nobody's there defending, and he's able to get an easy lay-in. Well, that doesn't really happen as much when he's at Kansas because there's multiple defenders just kind of camped in the paint being like, okay, whatever, you're going to, So I find that interesting. And then I think the other part of this here too has to be a confidence thing because you look at the free throw shooting numbers, right? Down considerably from last year at Alabama. And then you look at the deep shooting numbers because I don't think this is as simple to say, Bill Self isn't allowing him to shoot as many deep threes and that has killed his confidence. No, we've seen guys, Devontae Graham, Svi Mikhailuk, Sharon Collins did it a fair amount here and there, right? We've seen guys at Kansas be able to have the green light, Ochai Baji, Christian Brown here and there on shooting those very deep threes. Bill Self isn't as concerned with that as some people might think. Zeke Mayo does it on this very team. Zeke Mayo does it a good amount of times where he's shooting like a very deep three and he's not getting pulled from the game. So I think this has more to do with, I don't think this has as much to do with like, Bill Self has hurt his confidence. I think this is just his confidence has been shot a little bit by maybe being in and out of the lineup, which maybe you could indirectly, well, I guess still directly, but point to Bill Self. But I don't think it's like you could say maybe the Bill Self relationship with Ryland Griffen is hurting his confidence, or that his lack of success consistently or being in and out of the lineup is affecting his confidence. But I don't think it's like a direct Bill Self saying, hey, don't shoot that deep three. Like, it's definitely not that. So that gives me hope, because it's like he could easily have a game upcoming here. And I think the idea was that that first Houston game was going to be that game that raised his confidence and got him going. But then he gets benched shortly after that. And it's like, okay, back to the confidence being down. If he can have another one of those big games from three and you keep him in the starting lineup moving forward, I think that's a way that you see his confidence go up, and the confidence goes up. Free throw percentage goes up. I think those deep threes go in a little bit more. And so I also look at the fit stuff where it's like, I have questions about, what was ever the fit with AJ Storr at Kansas. I don't have those questions. I still don't with Ryland Griffen, because, again, you want to make him a corner three-point shooter? Great. He shoots them well. 44% last year, 37% this year. Even though it's lower this year, that's still a really good percentage to shoot from beyond the arc. And then if you're looking at really the one fit being like defense, which, I guess you could make that argument that like maybe at this point we should just only look to transfers who play good defense, because that's what Bill Self wants. But at the same point in time, Zeke Mayo hasn't been a great defender. Diggy Coit, I think, tries hard on the defensive end, but like he's not a plus defender on the defensive end. So I look at this and this one is a little bit more, it's a lot more perplexing about why it's gone wrong. But I also have certain reasons that I point to, and I'm still like, I still think this can work, whether it's the rest of this season and or you hope in the future moving forward, if you can convince him to come back for another year. All right, what is the lesson here for KU? We discuss on the other side. Thanks for joining us on Locked On Jayhawks. What is the lesson that KU can take away from bringing on Ryland Griffen and AJ Storr? I think fit, and fit. We've heard other coaches, whether it's Kelvin Sampson at Houston or Nate Oates at Alabama, coaches who have done well at the transfer portal, Dan Hurley with UConn, talk about bringing in guys who fit to the roster and bringing in guys who fit that mold. And then that can come from a couple different ways, right? That can come in the DNA of the player, so to speak, like for Bill Self, he wants junkyard dogs, right? Like he wants guys who are going to be tenacious, who are going to dive on the floor, who are going to play good defense, stuff like that, right? That can be the almost identity from that perspective. It can also come from a standpoint of, hey, we shoot a lot of mid-range shots, or we shoot a lot of corner threes. Let's go find a guy who's good at corner threes, right? They might only be 34% from three, but he's shooting 39% on corner threes, right? Find the right fits for your roster and find guys that are content if they don't necessarily have the biggest role in the world, because that probably couldn't have helped either for Kansas, that you had players expecting giant roles and haven't gotten in. It probably doesn't make the locker room super happy all the time, right? So finding the right fit, I think, is as important as anything. Now, what does that fit mean? Again, I'm going to be kind of pointing to moving forward. Like, I think you don't always get a Kevin McCullough out there, right? Who ended up being third team All Big 12 his first year at Kansas, and then third team All American by at least one publication his second year at Kansas, even despite the injury. So I don't mean to say like, oh, just go get another Kevin McCullough. It's not that easy. You don't always have players that are that good just overall who are out there for you that turn into NBA draft picks. But from the standpoint of like, if Bill Self has the option between bringing in the next Ryland Griffen, whoever that ends up being, and bringing in the next Kevin McCullough, again, just talking like player archetypes here, I think that he needs to bring in the Kevin McCullough one. And even though like the offensive entertainment, basketball, wanting the fun stuff, wanting the modern college basketball side of me, and the side of me that's like, hey, you're going to have Flory and Darren Peterson. You need 3-point shooting around him. Once that, I think it's better for Kansas and for Bill Self if he has a guy that mends with him. And even if they're not as good of a 3-point shooting team, if they're a better team overall because you're not clashing with guys and you're able to figure out these roles right away, that's a much better place to be in. It's almost like that, when you hear coaches all the time be like, you know what, if you mess up the play, or I don't care if you go the wrong way, just go 100% when you do it. And that's almost how I feel that this is here. It's like with Bill Self, he's like, you know what, at this point, let's just bring in the defensive guy. I don't care if this is the wrong way to go about it, and we're just going to, anchor in on these things. Let's just go for the identity. Let's just go for the 100% effort. And like you see teams like Texas A&M, for instance, who like they're one of the better teams in the country. They're a horrible 3-point shooting team. But they're just like an insane offensive rebounding and defensive team. Like you can win that way. It's not the most entertaining style. I don't know that consistently wins in March necessarily, but still, like I would have loved for KU to have added Kobe Brea, who at Kentucky is giving them, double-digit points per night, 44, over 40% from three. He's playing 25 minutes a night at Kentucky. Is he playing more than 15 a night, though, at Kansas, right, with Bill Self? So if that's where we're at, where it's like, I can give you the best ingredients in the world from the grocery store, but no matter what I give you, you're going to come out making a cheeseburger. Well, then maybe we should just go shop in the I was about to say the cheeseburger aisle. There's not a cheeseburger aisle at the store. I swear, I shop. But yeah, I'll just go pick up some ground beef. I'll go pick up some slices of cheese. I'll go pick up some buns. I'll go pick up some condiments. Like, I ain't gonna spend time going and buy some filet mignon for you to turn it into a burger, right? Like that. That's kind of how I view this. So I think that's kind of the lesson here for KU. And then there are certain shooters that I think make sense to bring on. But when I'm looking at that, look at the guys who have had success at those shooters. And I guess you could say a little bit with Zeke Mayo here, but when I look at Diggy Coit, it seems like the staff loves him. Staff love Jalen Coleman-Lands. Shooters that are content being on a given night, 7th, 8th, 9th man. And if they're hot, they'll play a little bit more. If they're not, maybe it's 5 minutes a night. Maybe it's 8 minutes a night for that specific guy. But maybe that's just what makes sense, that your shooters are the guys that come off the bench and are content in that specific role. And then I think there's probably another part of this lesson about steering more into the high school level of things. But at the same point in time, you're going to be losing a lot of players next season, and you're going to have to bring in portal additions. So I don't think, and even in the future, if you do start to build up more at the high school level, you still are probably going to have to bring on 2, 3, 4 transfer portal kids every year. That's just the current stage of college basketball. So you better just find a way to do it better, and you better find a way to do it that it fits your program and fits your identity. And so that's kind of what I'm looking at here. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including our YouTube page, a little KU football spring ball primer coming on tomorrow's episode, and a little KU Texas Tech preview on Friday. See you then.